Welcome to PPR Podcast number 103. My name is Paul Rudy, but the star of the podcast, of course, is to my right, Mr. Bert Grossman, Strikeforce president, who, by the way, they are sponsoring our little chit-chat today. Would you like to introduce our hot seat guest?
I would. He's the star today. Jim Trotter. God, so much I could say. Sports Illustrated, ESPN, The Atlantic now, the NFL, the Seau book. I could go on and on.
You know, Jim, when I first met you way back when, I knew I was talking to somebody who was on the fast track to be bigger than anybody that was in that trailer that we were sitting in at Chargerland. You had an aura of success about you, and yet at the same time you were really cool and always were helpful to us trying to get our little high school football show off the ground. So it's an honor to have you now in this forum. Thank you for that.
No, I appreciate you having me. I don't know if I had any aura about me. I knew I always loved Prep Pigskin Report. And you guys could have done better, man. Phonetically, that is so hard to say.
I know.
Yes. I did 5 times fast.
Well, the story behind that, we thought we were just a one and done thing. And we didn't, had we known we were going to be around for 25 years, we probably would have maybe spent a little more time on the name. But enough about us. We'll get to that in a second. My opening question to you is, as you went from one major platform for another, your footprint in the sports journalism community kept getting bigger and bigger, and your social media following kept getting bigger and bigger. Is there pressure on you when suddenly you realize you can't have a bad day, you can't have a mistake in paragraph 3? You just get crucified for it. Do you feel that kind of pressure on your work to be perfect every time out?
No, not at all. I don't think any of us can handle that kind of pressure, that weight on our shoulders. Truthfully, Paul, I just always go out and try and do the best job that I can, understanding that I'm a flawed human being. I will make mistakes just like everyone else, but I think the key in always handling yourself when you make a mistake is owning up to it and being accountable for it. So, no, I don't put that kind of pressure on myself. My whole thing is, from the very beginning, truthfully, is just to try and never to embarrass myself or embarrass my family, and to simply give an honest day's work and do the best that I could.
Hey, Jim, I think the big story for the last 2 months has been the good old thing, you confronting him for a second time. Is that, obviously it was intentional. Was that something you went back and forth with? Because, you know as well as I know, and Paul knows, NFL's like state-run media. It's almost like you're up there talking to Vladimir Putin, and if you say this, you're going to get poisoned or you're going to get fired.
Are we talking about Roger Goodell?
Yeah, in February at the Super Bowl summit. Talking about race in the front office and also in the media and everything else. Did you know that going in that was going to be an issue?
Yeah, you always know if you poke the bear, there's a chance for the bear taking a swipe back at you. But, the reality is, Bert and Paul knows this as well, that's our job. Our job is to hold people accountable. Our job is to ask the tough questions. And so if you stand up publicly and portray yourself to be one thing or portray the company to be one thing, then you should be prepared that people are going to hold you to that. And so when the NFL says repeatedly that diversity, equity, and inclusion are core principles of the league, and yet its hiring practices don't reflect that, it is my job to ask about that. And that's all I was doing, to be quite frank with you.
Well, hold on. So, I think a lot of people, when I look at it, you're asking specifically African Americans, and they're talking diversity, equity, inclusion, which that could mean a whole set of people. But the NFL is 70% African American, but they might be talking about a Guamanian guy that works in the front office somewhere.
Bert, that's an excellent point, because I was very specific in what I was asking. Look, the reality is that the wealth that has been generated in the NFL has been generated largely on the backs of black players. As you say, 60 to 70% of the player population in the NFL is black. And so when you have that, and yet you have owners who will not hire blacks as head coaches, when you have a newsroom where I worked, where there was not one black manager, there was not one black copy editor, there was not one full-time black employee on the news desk, and yet we're making decisions every day about how we cover this player population and who covers it and what the angles are. There's a problem there. So I felt that I had to bring it up. And look, people only see the question to Roger Goodell, and I understand why they focus on that. But internally, I had been asking about these things for years. and had not been able to make any headway. And that's the reason ultimately I decided to ask Roger about it. You know, when we did a podcast at one time, we tried to get Roger Goodell on our podcast several different times, and he never came on. Now, I don't know if he ever got the message that we were trying to get him on. I know we talked to his people, but he never came on our podcast to even talk about these things. So my feeling is you have to meet people where they are. And if they're not going to allow you to ask those questions of them, you know, in private or during a public session in terms of the podcast, then I'm going to ask you where I can get you. And that was one of the areas that I could get Roger in terms of asking him a question was at the Super Bowl.
Going back to the inequity, the imbalance that you were talking about in the newsroom and in the front office, do you think that affected the Colin Kaepernick coverage?
Without question, 100%. And, you know, that for me, Paul, when we start talking about my career and whatnot, and I think you know this, when you've done this long enough, what you start to do is ask yourself, kind of, what's my purpose as you get closer to the finish line? And I'm a hell of a lot closer to the finish line than the starting line. And so when Colin took a knee, I remember how I was working at ESPN at the time, and when the story came out that he was not standing for the anthem, if you'll remember, the very next game was in San Diego, and it was on Military Appreciation Night. It was the final preseason game of the 2016 season. And so ESPN said, hey, we want you to cover it, knowing that I live in San Diego. And I said, okay, no problem. And so I'm doing a hit for SportsCenter before the game, and I'm listening to the host in my ear frame the question in such a way that Colin is being disrespectful to the military, that he's being disrespectful to the flag, all these other things. And in my head, I'm saying, wait a minute, that's not what he's doing at all. What he is doing is trying to bring attention to police brutality against people of color, and specifically black people. And so I had to make a choice in that moment. Was I going to let the host frame the question in that way and just sort of go along with it? Or was I going to correct the host professionally and politely, of course, and say, no, this is what he is fighting against? And I chose to make that choice where I was going to change the narrative on that. And from that point forward, I said, look, whatever time I have left in the business here, I'm going to try and give a voice to those whose voices aren't being heard, and to make sure that these issues are framed in such a way that people can see them from a different perspective. And that's all I've tried to do going forward.
And it is framed, I mean, it's it's framed different for the players than it is for the owners.
For the fans?
For the fans.
I mean, everyone's got a take on it.
Yeah.
You know, like, I'm Pollyannish. I watch football to get away from the world's problems. And now I find in all sport, it's not just NFL, but it's become very political. And there is no respite, if you will. Which leads to my question to both you guys, actually. You know what? I grew up wanting to be an NFL. You know, I didn't want to be a cop. I didn't want to be a fireman. I wanted to play in the NFL. But now at age 62, the league and the badge, I'm jaded. I see it as just a money machine business,
yeah.
and I've lost the NFL's lost its allure to me. Have you guys experienced that at all, or do you still hold it?
I was jaded. I was jaded the day I got drafted. I held out forever. I came to a last preseason game. They took me up to meet Spanos. He was sitting there with Bob Hope, and then Spanos leaned over to Bob Hope and said, "That's the Jew that held me up for all the money." That was my very first day signing. And it was accepted. I mean, I laughed, but whatever. But that was the day. I mean, everything's jaded for you when you walk. Once you start getting a paycheck, it's jaded. I mean, it becomes a job.
But it's gotten increasingly more. I don't know, Jim.
I'll say this to you, Paul. What I have learned to do is to compartmentalize and to say, I love the game. I love football. I love everything associated with it. But I do not like the business of football. And so I have to compartmentalize it in that way, because when you see the underbelly of the NFL, and it's not just the NFL, it's corporate America, really. And the way that people are not treated as people, as human beings, where everything is about the bottom line. You know, I'll give you a story about the NFL. So during the pandemic, they made cuts to people's pensions. reduce them during that time because they were supposedly, the revenue wasn't as great because fans weren't in the stadiums, et cetera, et cetera. They went to us talent, and talent means front-facing people on camera. And because we are contracted employees, they couldn't just reduce our pay. We had to volunteer to have our pay cut. And so I said to them, if I take this 10% pay cut or this 15% pay cut for 6 months or whatever it was, is it going to help us keep people employed? They said yes. I said, fine, take the money. I gave up the money voluntarily. No sooner did we get through the major part of the pandemic, the NFL signed record TV deals, right? And what did they do? They fired 150 people. And so I remember I went on social media and I said, the next time the NFL tells you that football is family, don't believe it. Because I don't know about you, but I don't treat my family this way. And so
I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's when it really hit me personally, because these were people that I knew. And I knew that there was no reason for them to be fired because the NFL wasn't losing money. And I'll never forget, I texted a couple of owners and I said, you know, this may be me whining, but I have to ask this. And I said, when is enough for you guys, right? How much money do you need? And independently, each of them answered the same way and said, that's a really good question. And I just thought that spoke volumes to me. Because again, we're playing with people's lives here when we start firing them simply for the sake of wanting more money to buy another yacht or whatever it may be. And that part just doesn't sit well with me. And so I have to compartmentalize it because I do love the game. I do love the camaraderie aspect. I do love the life's lessons that come from playing sports. But the business of it, you can have it.
And it goes, I mean, they have such a strong popular product that they can almost do whatever they want. And it hasn't really changed much. I mean, no matter what we go through. I mean, you're getting the Bill Nunn Award at the Hall of Fame thing. So you'll probably sit at the front table with Goodall.
Yeah.
Will this come up again in that speech?
I haven't decided. I haven't written my speech yet. But it's funny. People think it'll be awkward for me to sit at a table with Goodell. And the truth is, it won't be. I don't have anything against Roger Goodell. I don't know Roger Goodell personally. I only know him in the way that all of us know him, and that's through the job that he does as commissioner. My job is to report on the job that he does. So I don't have anything personal against him. I don't dislike him. How do I dislike someone I don't even know? So it's not going to be awkward for me at all. And my thing is, again, as I have said, everything that I have brought up, as it relates to the NFL and the question that I ask Goodell and whatnot, is all asked out of this desire to see the NFL be who it says it is. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. And I have told officials at the NFL that I believe, as the most popular league in this country, if not the world, that there is a social contract between the NFL and the public. And that means that the NFL should be everything that it says it stands for. And so when it says it stands for all of these things, I want to see it. And if I don't, I'm going to ask you about it. If that angers or irritates some people, that's not on me. That's on them.
So the slogans in the end zone don't quite cut it as far as the social contract is concerned. I mean,
man, look, all right, I have said this. No. I have said this so many times. The minute that they announced they were singing the Black National Anthem, the 1 year after George Floyd was murdered, I said, who in the hell sat in an office and thought this was a good idea? It is, I mean, you talk about pandering and being performative. I'm like, don't put hashtags in the end zone of end racism, and then among your top 11 executives at the league office, there are only 2 blacks, or in your newsroom, you don't have a black manager or a black copy editor or a full-time black employee on the news desk. I mean, stop with it. The fact that over the last 5 years now, we are starting a season with only 3 head coaches who identify as black is insulting, to act as if these men are not capable of leading teams. So again, all of that, all of the performative gestures and whatnot, stop with it. Just show me through your actions what you're really about. And maybe they'll say, we are showing you. Or at least critics would say, they are showing you.
Isn't it like that with everything, though? I mean, we do that. We talked when you were writing the book on Seau, and that was right when the concussion thing came out. That was, they went through every dog and pony show to make it look like they cared. That was 5 years ago. Now I'm seeing Tua almost die on the field, stumble around, he's back in. Domestic violence, same thing. They'll do that. They're reactive to any incident, and then it goes away. And now it's racism, and it'll go away. And it'll be on to the next thing, and nothing ever gets fixed, it seems. It's just reactive, put a Band-Aid on it, get past it, and bat down the hatches for the next thing.
But see, this is something that you talked about earlier, and I can't remember if you used this word or not, and if you didn't, I'll use it for you. There is an arrogance about the NFL.
Uh-oh.
And why does the NFL have that arrogance? It's because we are like Pavlov's dogs. And when the whistle blows, we come running on Sundays to watch that game, regardless of what has happened. As you say, it could be domestic violence. It could be DUI. It could be cheating. It could be race norming and the concussion settlement, CTE, all of these things. We come running to watch that game, and they know that. So how many businesses are there in this world, not just this country, where it is almost fail-proof, where you can't mess it up, where no matter what you do, that audience is going to be there and the revenues are going to be there. The NFL is that business. And so there is that arrogance among some there, including among the leadership, that, you know what, no matter what we do, we're going to be okay.
I want to get to Junior in just a bit, but just last, as we segue into something else I want to talk about. What NFL owner has impressed you that you thought, you know what, this guy does it right? And then let's leave it there. Is there an NFL owner that comes to mind that, you know what, I could work for this guy?
Yeah, I think there are owners that get it and who care. The issue that I have is, though, when they get in a room together for the sake of the business, they will all vote in unison. So I'll give you, for instance, in 2018, after they had gotten through the heavy part of the kneeling controversy, right, it was starting to die out. Nobody was talking about it anymore. There were only a handful of players who were even kneeling. And so the owners meet in Atlanta. And on their agenda is a topic that they are going to rewrite the anthem policy. And so they were basically going to say, if you are on the field for the anthem, you must stand. If not, stay in the locker room, no repercussions. And so I remember reaching out to some owners before that meeting saying, why are you doing this? You know, I know that you agree with what Colin is fighting for. The issue has sort of died down. Why are you even discussing this now? And some of these owners said, yeah, I've talked to my coach and talked to these people, and you're right. We don't need to mess with anything, yada, yada, yada. So the night before the vote, I'll never forget, I'm talking to Troy Vincent, the executive vice president of football operations for the NFL. And he's basically saying to me that owners he has talked to have kind of said the same things to him that I'm saying to him. I wake up the next morning and we find out that they voted to change the anthem policy. And so reach out to these owners again. I said, what did I miss? Like, when we talked, you said no need to mess with anything. And then what I was told is, well, we saw that the vote wasn't there to leave the policy as is, and so we want to present a unified front. And so there were two teams, I believe, that abstained from voting. But that's what we deal with here. So even people of principle and people who I know to have principle get in these meetings, find out they don't have enough support behind them, and then for the sake of the business, end up voting as one.
And then you also have dominant, if Jerry Jones says one thing, it carries a lot more weight than Dean Spanos, and then they're all going to fall in line with that.
You bring up
but I'll say this to you, Bert, too. There are a lot of owners in there that don't like Jerry Jones. And so when he talks, they don't listen, and they love going against him. Where they listen to Jerry is when it comes to money, because he has shown he can make money.
When's the last time you spoke with Dean Spanos?
Probably the playoffs last year, I'm thinking.
And
I'll communicate with his son maybe more than Dean, since John is running,
running the show now.
Football Lives. But yeah, no, we'll talk every now and then.
Is he the villain that he's often painted in the San Diego sports? As we look back on the archives and the folklore of the Chargers here in town, is Dean Spanos the villain that he is portrayed as?
You know what, Paul? There are a lot of villains in that story.
Yes, there is.
And I always find it interesting that we always try and choose one. There are a lot of villains. And I'm going to go one step further, looking beyond the obvious. To me, the number one villain in that story is the NFL itself, from this standpoint. When they voted to allow the Rams to go into LA, if you'll remember, they also announced that there would be a 1-year window for the Chargers to negotiate with San Diego, and that if they didn't come to a stadium agreement in that time, the Chargers would have first dibs on being the second team in LA. And then the Raiders would have second dibs on that. So what they did, in essence, is they forced the Chargers' hands to say that if you can't get a deal done within this year, basically, you're going to have to go to LA, because then you lose all of your leverage in San Diego, knowing that the Raiders would have gone into LA as the number 2 team. So to me, that was the flaw in the whole thing when the league set it up that way, because they basically forced the Chargers out of San Diego if the Chargers couldn't get a deal done within a year, which we know they didn't get that deal done.
And no one talks about that. I mean, it's too easy to hate on Spanos and the family. I think looking back on it, I think the last interview Dean Spanos ever did with San Diego media was with Brandon Stone the day of this all came down up in the.
He's such a dynamic speaker. I'm about to look that one. I'm about to look that one up and watch it.
Or just to close the book on the NFL part of this conversation. Well, first of all, Junior Seau, as a player, where does he rank in the all-time folklore?
Oh, God, he's one of the all-time greats, man. I don't know that I can get into ranking 1 through 10 or 20 or 50.
Best Charger you ever saw?
That I ever saw personally?
Yeah.
Yes. He and LaDainian, without question, are the 2 greatest that I ever covered. Obviously, they were great players before I started covering the franchise. But here's the thing you have to remember, Paul, about Junior. For me, he was more than just a player to me. And you've outlined my career and the steps that I've taken. Those steps don't happen without Junior. And I've told this story before, but I'll tell it again just quickly. He took me under his wing when I started covering the Chargers back in 95, 96. And people think that he would give me inside information. He never did. That's the funny thing to me. He was so protective of the team that he was not one of those guys who was leaking information. What he did for me is he taught me the culture of a locker room, and he taught me the mentality of a professional athlete. And so I give you, for instance, there's 1 year, if you'll recall, the Chargers signed Ryan McNeil in free agency, a cornerback. Right. So we get to training camp, and Ryan just looks awful. I mean, he's getting beaten up and down the field. He's got this big money contract. And so I'm at the point where I'm like, I'm going to have to write a story saying they really blew this. And so I go to Junior as the leader of the team and the leader of the defense, and I start asking him about it. And he said to me, he goes, Try, you got to understand, veteran players don't use training camp to work on their strengths. They use training camp to work on their weaknesses. And he said, that's what he's doing. Fast forward, Ryan McNeil led the NFL in interceptions that year. So imagine how stupid I would have looked
had you
writing that story, and how I would have burned any credibility in the locker room if I had written that story. And then this guy goes out and leads the league in interception. And so those were the kind of things that Junior helped me with. And, I'll never forget after his first quote unquote graduation, when he held the press conference here in San Diego, and then less than a week later signed with New England. But after that press conference, he was like, hey, some of us are getting together down at the restaurant tonight. why don't you come down, and just hang out for a minute? So I'm like, okay. So I go down, and there's one point during this thing where we're all seated out on the patio outside, and it's a round table, and you have people like his personal trainer, someone from his foundation, all these different people. And I'll never forget that moment where each of us kind of went around the table, and it was organic. It wasn't planned or anything. And we all just talked about how he had impacted our lives in terms of our careers and what he had done for us without even knowing that he had done it. And those are the things I remember about him more than anything. Did he have his flaws? Absolutely. We all do, all human. But man, I would not be in this chair. I would not be receiving these awards that I'm receiving if not for Junior Seau, and I'm forever indebted to him.
Jim, I just, for those who don't know, before becoming an icon in the sports journalism world, you did preps, did you not?
Oh, yeah, and stop with the icon stuff. I'm not an icon.
Well, to me, you are.
Yeah. When I got to San Diego, I was, I think, roughly 3 years out of college, and I came in as a preps writer. And I was covering East County preps, so I had the Grossmont League and whatnot. And I tell this story to young people. I know you heard it the other day, Paul, but it's very important in this business to have advocates and people who are honest with you. Not just people who tell you what you want to hear, but people who tell you what you need to hear. And so I'll never forget one time I went in the sports editor's office and I was looking for some validation. I'd taken in a story and he was an old school guy who marked it all up with red ink and all of that and whatnot. And so when we get through talking about the story and whatnot, obviously I want to climb the professional ladder. And I sort of ask him about it. And he basically tells me he was a straight shooter from Philly, East Coast guy, the chain smoking, flask in the drawer type guy.
Wait, you work for my dad?
Yeah. And he looks at me from behind his glasses and he basically says, you're never going to be anything more than a journeyman. I never forget he told me my writing lacked passion and said something else, but the whole journeyman thing stuck with me. So I remember at that point I had a choice to make. I could either listen to him, be crushed by him, and I don't want to say call it a career, but, reduce my aspirations, or I could take the things that he said that I felt were constructive and true and needed to be worked on and work on those things and seek to continue to climb the ladder, which is what I did. Fast forward a couple of years later, 2-3 years later, when the papers merged, he's no longer there. The new sports editors decided to give me an opportunity, asked me to be the backup on the Chargers for 1 year. I did that, and the next year they were like, we want you to be the lead beat writer. And that's how it all got started. So if I had let him determine my fate, if you will, I would not be sitting here today.
I saw Jim speak at the San Diego Association for Black Journalists, and at the invitation of your co-founder, your friend Jerry, and telling people what they need to hear. I almost fell out of my chair when you said, when you delivered this quote, if you're afraid to be fired, or if you're squeamish about being fired, don't get into this business. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. Look, the business has changed since I got into it. I graduated in 1986, and so for all of the students who were there receiving awards that day, they weren't even born yet. But journalism was a different time then, particularly in newspapers. A lot of newspapers were family owned, and so there was more of a commitment to the principles of journalism as opposed to the profit margin. And so as that began to change and hedge funds began to buy newspapers and the focus grew more and more to be on the bottom line, we saw journalism change where integrity and all of those things and quality work were not as important as, maximizing revenue streams. And so what you have seen over the last decade plus, if not more, is you have seen really talented journalists being fired, not because their work is not good, but because maybe they make too much money or places just want to downsize to increase their profit margins. And so the first time it ever happened to me, I had never been fired in my life, other than college, where I got fired from the school newspaper because we were standing up and protesting the administration for trying to censor a cartoon that we were running. And I ended up getting fired there. But other than that, I'd never been fired in my life. And so I was at Sports Illustrated. They were going to take the magazine public, and so they were going to have an IPO. And so they were trying to get real lean and this, that, and the other. So I'm in New York for the Super Bowl that year. An email comes out that there's going to be another round of buyouts and layoffs. And so I go to my boss and I say, hey, do I need to be concerned about this? And I was told, no, you don't. You're good. NFL's the number one beat at the magazine, whatever. So I'm like, okay. So my naivete, I am driving my wife to the dentist one day, and the phone rings, and I see that it's from the office. And so I'm figuring that my boss is calling to talk about our next story or whatever. And right away, he's like, he goes, hey, I got some bad news for you. He goes, we're going to have to let you go. And I'm like, okay. And it was, well, it's nothing about your work, excuse me, or your production. It's just that you make too much money and we're trying to get lean and whatever. And so that was my introduction, my personal introduction to this new age of journalism. And, I was fortunate enough that within a few hours, I had a pretty good feel that I was going to have another job. I had already talked to ESPN and they were setting up an interview. So I was one of the lucky ones, right? But there are others who aren't as fortunate, and I don't take that for granted for a day. But what it did for me, and this is the lesson I always tell young people, is regardless of how comfortable you feel, no matter if you are doing a great job, whatever, always have a plan B, right? Always have an exit so that if you get that phone call that I got when I was pulling up to the dentist office, you've got something else, and I've never forgotten that. And so that's why I say to young people, if you are afraid of being fired, don't get into this business, because the likelihood is you will be fired one day. And that is not a reflection on you necessarily. It is simply a reflection on the business and the culture that we're in today.
Jim, we've kept you longer than I said we would. I know you've got work to do, so thank you for making a half hour available to us. I wish you well, and thank you for all your kindnesses over the years as it relates to helping us with our show. You've been always kind to say a good word, even about Bert. So,
no, man, I appreciate it. It's not too long. I love PPR. Love seeing the young kids, have their moment, and you guys killed it. And the other thing, I'm sorry, my voice, I need some water. But the other thing that's so great about PPR, beyond just the players or the student athletes that you cover, is that it also gives an opportunity to young sports journalists to be a part of it and to get some training. So I thank you for that, because things like that are invaluable. I remember when I was in college, our SID would let me work in the SID office, and he would treat me like a reporter. He would have me write on the games and, help allow me to do advanced work, that sort of thing. So the experience that you are giving to these young journalists, sports journalists, is invaluable. So I thank you for that, and I'll always be a supporter of PPR.
Frankly, it's the thing that motivates. That's the part of the show I like the most, is launching careers, and I can proudly say we've launched more than our share. So,
thank you, Jim.
Yeah, Jim, thank you. Be safe.
Right.
Enjoy Tina Turner, the musical. Did that arrive?
Sir.
Did that show up?
Yes, thank you.
All right, beautiful. All right, sir, have a safe day. Okay.
All right, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Bert.
Thank you, Jim.
PPR Podcast 103 is done, everybody. Turn off the machines.